everyone, and welcome to the Grow Your Own webinar series. We're with Sudbury Shared Harvest, and this is a collaboration with the amazing Greater Sudbury Public Library. And so today, our series topic is about composting. And at Sudbury Shared Harvest, we love composting. And actually, we just got this new bin built and delivered by the Cambrian College Research and Development section of Cambrian College. So thanks to them for that. It's a 3-bin composting system. And but before we talk about composting, we have to talk about the soil food web. So I have a quick question for Chanel over here. Chanel actually knows the most about soils on our entire team, but I'm going to ask her this anyways. How many microorganisms are in 1 teaspoon of soil?
What about 100,000?
100,000 is a good guess. It's even higher.
A million?
A billion.
Wow.
There is over 1 billion microorganisms in just 1 teaspoon of healthy garden soil. And these microorganisms are so important because they're actually responsible for all of the terrestrial life on Earth. So all of the plants that you see growing, vegetables, trees, all of them are dependent on the microorganisms. And that's because without them, the plant debris and the things produced in the forest or in the garden wouldn't return back to the earth. So nothing would decompose. I can't imagine a world where nothing decomposed. So our goal when we are composting is to try and create an ideal environment for the microorganisms so that they can do their job of being great decomposers. So now I'm going to get into the magic and the science behind composting. Composting, the official scientific term would be managed aerobic decomposition. So aerobic in this case means involving oxygen. So you need oxygen to compost. There's a few things you need to compost actually. You need heat, you need water, you need oxygen like I mentioned, and you also need nutrients. So your nutrients are a vital part of producing a good compost bin that's a good environment for your microorganisms. And the types of nutrients that you need are carbon and nitrogen. But there's an easy way to remember this. You can think of carbon as your browns, and you can think of nitrogens as your greens. I'll show you. So here we have a bucket of browns, and this is anything from dried twigs, dried leaves, straw, cardboard, shredded paper, wood chips even, sawdust, you name it. Anything high in carbon that is usually dried looking like that is called a brown. And then we have our greens. And greens are basically anything fresh. So they're often green in color, but not always. But you can think things like fresh grass clippings, fresh weeds that you just pulled, your food scraps. So those banana peels, leftover rice from dinner, that's all considered high in nitrogen. And all of this is really important for a good compost pile. But there's a specific ratio to remember, and that is 2 greens to 1 browns. And so this ratio is important whether you're building a new compost pile or you're just adding to your existing one. So if you're building a new compost pile, you can do a layering method. Let's go over here and I can sort of demonstrate. So this would be an example of a compost heap that was just started. And that would be an example of a layer of browns. And then you can add on top of it a double layer of greens. And then on top of that, a single layer of browns, a double layer of greens, and so on. But the important part is to remember that your compost heap should be about 3 feet by 3 feet wide. And I'll get into why in a second. But this is what you would do if you were just adding to your regular home composter. So here we have Chanel, who is turning the compost. And I'm just going to add some brown ingredients. that she'll eventually chop up, and some green ingredients that will also be chopped. So the reason that we chop up the ingredients is more surface area. The more surface area of your food scraps and yard waste that's exposed to microorganisms means it will get decomposed faster. So that's why we like to break things up into small pieces like Noah is doing over here. It could be a hard job, but having the right tools makes it a lot easier. And as you can see with this design, turning is made really easy because it has these removable wooden slats that can fit into the composter. So that allows easy access to turn your compost pile. If you have a really big compost pile, it's going to be really hard to turn. So that's why we recommend that 3 feet by 3 feet measurement. But smaller is okay if that's all that you have. And remember that a closed system actually will compost better than an open system. And that's because of one super important thing, heat. So like I mentioned, those 4 things, do you remember what they are, Chanel?
Air, heat, water,
and oxygen. Oh,
air.
That's air.
Nutrients.
Nutrients. Okay, so heat. Yes, you want your compost pile to be hot. You do, because heat is actually what is produced by your microorganisms and organisms working really, really, really hard decomposing. So if your compost pile is heating up, take it as a really, really good sign. One day here on a foggy day, it was actually steaming. And so that was a real treat to see because it means that the microbes are really active. But yeah, your compost pile can become too hot. So if it reaches really high temperatures, it can actually kill off some of the beneficial microorganisms. So one thing that you can do to manage the heat is to turn your compost pile like Chanel's doing. And in the beginning stages of composting, we want to turn a bit more often, like every 2 or 3 days. And then as you get later in the stages of decomposition, turning about every 3 to 5 days will be sufficient. And like I said, ensuring that you have good enough heat by keeping your compost pile nice and big, covering it if you can, and also balancing the nutrients and the moisture content can all contribute to heat. So it's all interconnected. In terms of water, it's important to keep your compost pile moist. So if it's too wet, so let's say, I'll show you. If I were to grab this and it was dripping wet, that would be far too moist. And if it's too moist, that means that it's an environment for anaerobic decomposers. So the decomposers that don't require oxygen. And these decomposers actually produce a really sulfury kind of rotten egg smell that doesn't smell good at all. But I see this and I squeeze it in my hand. It feels moist, but not dripping. Doesn't smell like rotten eggs. This is perfect. It likely means that there's a good balance of greens and browns. A good amount of water was added to it if it became too dry. And yeah, it's looking good. So water, air, nutrients. Okay, so that's basically the 4 different components of having a healthy composter. Turning your compost pile can also help speed up decomposition. Like I mentioned, it can help to lower the temperatures if it's too hot. It can also help to raise the temperatures. So if your compost pile is starting to cool, turning it and exposing more surface area to more microorganisms will actually heat it up and help decomposition to speed up, which is really great. And so the second last thing that I wanted to share with you guys today was that there's 4 different stages of decomposition. And it is pretty important to know because it'll help you know what you're looking for in your composter to see if the different elements are managed correctly. So in the first few days is called the mesophilic stage. And that is basically when your composter is just starting to get going, the organisms are just starting to decompose, and it's the beginning of the decomposition process. And then you move into your thermophilic decomposition stage. And this is between a few days to a few weeks. And this is the hot period. This is where you might see the steam, and that's because of all the energy that the organisms' bodies are giving off. And so this is where you want to be turning every few days. After that, within a few weeks to a few months, will be your cooling stage. And during this stage, a lot of your heat-loving microorganisms will die off, and they'll be replaced with cooler climate-loving organisms, usually larger sized organisms. And so once you start to see more worms, more potato bugs, nematodes, things like that in your composter, it's probably because it's approaching the cooling phase. And then eventually it's curing. And all you need to do during this phase is just leave it. And that's because all of the food and the resources that were being consumed by your microorganisms are now spent. And so what you're left with is rich, amazing, delicious compost that you can add to your gardens. But why would we do this?
So why do we compost, Kristlyn?
We compost because it helps the planet. That's the main reason. So basically, composting can help to sequester carbon from the atmosphere. And it does this because when plants photosynthesize, they draw carbon from the atmosphere and convert it to sugars and carbohydrates that are released through their roots. And when these exudates feed the microorganisms, their bodies become larger, and their bodies are made up of carbon, which means that the carbon that would have been in the atmosphere is now being stored underground. And if we do this on a large scale, adding compost to our gardens, we can actually help to fight climate change, which is really cool. Also, when you add this nutrient-rich compost to your gardens, you end up feeding the soil life. And those microorganisms, they cycle nutrients through the soil. They aerate the soil. They're really, really, really great for your plants. So it's great to add compost to your garden, and it's great to do composting. It also saves waste from ending up in the landfill, which 58% of food produced in Canada ends up wasted. So it's a good way that we could do our part.
Woo. All right, we have a question. Is the black container inside your composter made of plastic? And is it the only 3 sides to allow airflow?
There's no black container inside the composter, but I'll show you an empty one so you can see what it looks like. So that just has some soil in it from the bin next to it. And it's basically just lined with, it looks like a 1/4 inch or maybe a 1/2 inch wire mesh. And there is airflow on all sides. That's why the boards don't completely meet one another.
How often should you apply compost to your garden beds? And when do you know the compost is ready to apply?
You know the compost is ready to apply when it has no smell or smells like soil, and there's no visible debris within it. If you still have chunks of leaves or food waste, it's probably not ready. Also, it will look and feel like soil.
Great.
Yeah.
All right, there's another question.
Oh, sorry, I forgot to answer another part of that question, which is how often do you apply to your gardens? Well, we add compost to our gardens usually twice a year, actually, in the spring and in the fall as an extra boost of fertilization for them. And in general, annually is recommended, but you can add compost as needed if you notice your plants looking a little bit nutrient deficient.
Great. Is there any kind of compost or stage of compost that can harm your plants?
Sometimes compost can be unfinished, meaning that it hasn't completely cured. Adding fresh compost to your gardens can actually introduce some microorganisms that plants might not like very much. Some funguses sometimes. Yeah, so that can sometimes be something you would like to avoid. Other than that, I'm not too sure. I haven't heard of anything though.
Awesome. Any other questions?
What should you not add to your compost?
Oh, thank you so much for asking. This is so important. What you don't want to add to your compost, you don't want to add any meat. It decomposes a lot more slowly, so it might throw off the balance of your compost pile. You don't want to add fats. You don't want to add any weeds that have been sprayed with chemicals, or weeds that have gone to seed. Because if they've gone to seed, depending on this stage of composting, it might be a hot stage where the weed seeds get killed off, but generally we avoid it because the seeds can germinate in your compost pile and you could then add that to your garden when you add the compost. So that's basically.
What about like waste, like human waste, animal waste?
Yes, you don't want any excrement from pets or humans in your composter. Some people say excrement from herbivores is okay. I just caution against it.
Awesome.
Yeah. Happy composting!
If you have any more questions, you can leave them down in the comment section and we will get to them later. Great, thank you.